Hey, 10th grade, Miss Boyd here with the Yearling chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. Okay, so 13, it kind of picks up after the fight between Oliver, Penny, Jody, and the Foresters. So we have Jody waking up, and you have Grandma Hutto taking care of him, and of course, Penny making sure he's okay, and you have Jody worried about Oliver, and he got beat up pretty good. So for Jody, he's trying to figure out who he sides with because even his father says this will likely end neighboring with the Foresters. And for Jody, it makes him like have this terrible feeling in the pit of his stomach because it says literally he could not give up following. Like, why do I have to end my friendship with Fodderwing over this? So it makes him angry and resentful at Oliver, even more so than the Foresters, because for him, why in the world would you do this over a girl? He can't understand that. And he's not willing to lose Fodderwing because of all of this. So in the pain, it says too much pain was unjust and too many against one were unjust. So you have Jody trying to figure out in his mind, was it a right thing that they did fighting for Oliver? And in his mind, he knows that it was right because it wasn't fair that all of those Foresters were against Oliver. And so he feels good about fighting for Oliver, but he doesn't want it to hamper the friendship he has with Fodderwing, but he knows if it does, he feels in his stomach after he's thought through all of this that he did the right thing. So remember that Penny was supposed to be home previously. So at this point, they know they got to get back. So they go back to the store with Boyles, and they eventually get there. But before they leave, Jody goes and says goodbye to Oliver and apologize that they didn't get there sooner. And when he's in there, you have Oliver ask Jody to get a message to Twink that he's going to meet him. And of course, immediately Jody's angry and he's like, I'm not doing that. I hate her. And Oliver throws in there, well, I thought you were my friend. And then of course at that point he's like, well, now I have to do it. And he feels like he does. So he gets the message and says that he's going to deliver it to her. So Grandma Hutto is hoping that this fight is the end of the Twink Weatherby fiasco and not the beginning of it. So they leave, and Penny says, if you need us, you know where we are. They stop by the store, and they borrow his mare. So, because remember, Jody just got knocked out pretty good. So Jody can ride the horse, and then they get all of their supplies, etc., and they head back home. But before they decide to leave, remember, Jody's got to get the message to Twink. So you find out that Twink has left town. So you have this little note that Jody leaves for Oliver that says, your Twink has done goed up the river. Was an interesting read. And of course, he's glad that she's gone. So they make it back, and it in this last little paragraph in chapter 13, it says Oliver had never failed him before. The Foresters were all as rough as his mother insisted. He felt deserted, but he was sure Fodderwing would not change. And it says his father, of course, stood as unchangeable as the earth. So you have Jody, and he's trying to figure out whose side is he on, who's staying on his side. And it's this idea, like he's never been used to having to pick sides, and he's like, I like Fodderwing, but I like Oliver, but I don't like Twink, and I can't figure out who's right and who's wrong. And that's kind of where his mind's going with that. Now, chapter 14, it's talking about things growing. It's late summer, it's getting hot, and their hogs are missing, which is a big deal. there goes all their meat that they're going to store up for the winter. So you can tell in there, Penny has an idea where they are. So they're going to basically track their hogs, and they have an idea that the foresters have them. So they go and then they track them, and it's heading, you can tell, or Penny can tell that they've been baited. So they have an idea of once they follow the tracks, they'll be pinned somewhere on forester land. So for them, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, you can tell throughout here as they're packing food to go eat, and it talks about supper. It says supper was on the table. There was only clabber and cornbread, but that wasn't like there was enough. Like that's all the food that they have because their summer crops haven't come in. They don't have the meat from the pigs. There hasn't been much as far as hunting. So right now food is tight, and the fact that the foresters have taken their meat source is a huge deal. So the fact that they have the hogs makes Penny and Ma very, very worried. So as they're heading towards the foresters, this is when you have something that totally changes the dynamic. And as Penny's moving a vine, he gets bitten by a rattlesnake. So you have Penny kind of go, I mean, he kind of goes off, and Jody almost thinks he's gone mad, but he kills a doe and he cuts it open literally immediately while the blood's still fresh, the organs are still fresh, and he uses the liver and the heart to kind of draw out the poison in his arm. And he also slashes it above it to try to bleed the poison out so it doesn't get all through his body. So at this point, Pa has to try to make it back home, and he looks at Jody. He's like, "You've got to go to the Foresters, and you've got to ask them to ride for Doc Wilson. There's no way I can make it if Doc doesn't come." And he says to tell them to go by this road because if Penny can't make it, he'll have collapse there, and they can pick him up. So Penny strodes off home, but you'll notice that as they're cutting open the doe, you have Jody notice that this doe has a fawn, and Pa's like, "Sorry, boy, I can't help it. Come on." So Penny's got to head home to the best of his ability, and then Jody runs as fast as he can to the foresters. And you can tell he's you'd be nervous too, trying to ask them for help. So the only person he can think of is to yell for Fodderwing. Fodderwing doesn't come out. All the foresters come out, and Lim is quite vocal and is like, "You varmint, what are you like? What are you doing here?" And he asks for Fodderwing, and you find out that he's sick and he can't come outside. So at this point, Jody just has to tell him what's happened and hope that they'll help. So he tells him about the rattlesnake. "Please ride for Doc Wilson, please." And Lim just laughs at him. Um, and you'll notice that Buck and Melville are kind of crude in their comments, but they agree to help. And for Lim, he's like, "Die good riddance, I don't care." Like Lim's not going to help. But Buck and Melville say that they'll help. And for Jody, it bothers him because they said they'll help, but they're moving so slowly. But eventually they ride. And so you have Millwell basically, he goes to get Doc, and Doc's known to be a drunk. And you have Buck that's going to ride and pick up Penny on the way if he didn't make it. So this leaves Jody to travel all the way back the 4.5 miles home, and it's getting dark. And this is the first time he's ever it's not that it's the first time he's ever traveled in the dark, but this is the first time he's ever traveled like this without his father with him to help him be safe or help him feel safe. Um, and over again, it talks about the fact in here that for Jody, Penny is the one that makes him feel safe. And in Baxter's Island, Jody always feels like they have everything they need. He doesn't understand the meaning of rations and tight food and all of these things that Ma keeps talking about. He doesn't get it because for him, as long as Penny is there, the scraping for food and the danger and all of that goes on in nature stays outside Baxter's Island, and Penny is the one that keeps him safe. So here is the first instance where Jody feels afraid. And it literally says, Old Death was loose in the scrub. He kind of feels it all around him in the shadows. And he tries to get home as quickly as he can through the rain and all of that. So eventually he makes it home and he sees that Buck and Millwell are there. He gets inside and they just say hey to him. And so you have Jody go in there to check on his father. The doctor's there. And in his mind, Jody thinks if he's not dead yet, then he'll not die. That's what he keeps telling himself. If he's alive now, he's going to make it. And of course, he doesn't know that to be true. And when he sees his father and he looks and sees how awful the swelling is and the bruising, etc., keeps telling himself he's going to make it, he's going to make it. But in his mind, he's like, I don't know if that's really true or not. So when he walks in and Jody's totally soaked through and he changes his clothes, you have Penny say, you'll catch cold. And this is the first thing he said that proves he has his wits about him, that he recognized someone. And the doc says that's good. So you have Jody and Ma Baxter there. Basically, you have Ma kind of whimpering and you have Jody like, he's not going to die. He's not going to die. And of course, he doesn't really know that. But they're both worried, of course, about him. So you have them trying to get a little milk down him. And he gets a little bit because, I mean, they need the food in him because his body's fighting. So they start sweating, and sweating for poison is good. And Penny goes to sleep. So that night, Jody wants to sit up with his father. And as he's sitting up with his father, of course, his mind wanders. He thinks back to the fawn. And he said the catastrophe that might take his father had made it motherless. And this whole kind of idea of all of them being alone, the fawn being alone, Jody being alone without his father, it just made him cry and feel awful for himself and for the fawn. He's just all of the emotions of the day come out. So chapter 15 starts off with Jody having a terrible dream about rattlesnakes and his father dying, Penny being gone. And he wakes up and they check on Penny and it says he was breathing with greater ease. He was still swollen, still fevered, but he made it through the night. And the idea that he made it through that first night means he has a great chance of making it and living. So because of this, it's breakfast and Jody says, I need, he'll go milk for Ma and do all these chores for Ma. And it's like the first time he's ever offered to do that. And his father didn't have to for him. So when 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 he goes out there, Buck and Millwell are there and they stayed overnight basically just to see what will happen. And they both anticipated that Penny wouldn't make it. And when he does, they're completely surprised. So in this moment, they get the milk. And of course, he's still thinking about the fawn. And they get some more milk to Penny. And Buck and Millwell come in the room and check on him. And they can't believe he's still alive. And he basically is so worn out, he feels like he could sleep forever. So the problem is they have all these chores to be done. And Buck says, well, what's he got that needs to be done? Like what's going on? What do y'all have? And of course they say the corn and things like that. And Buck says, well, I'll stay and take care of it. I'll do some things for you. And you can tell Ma Baxter's totally taken off guard by that. This is not what she anticipated a forester to do. So Buck decides to stay and help them out a little bit with things that Penny would normally do. So while Ma's trying to get breakfast going, you have Jody bring up the fawn, and Ma's like, she doesn't even pay any attention. She doesn't really care. So she makes breakfast, a good breakfast, and she tells all the men to come in and eat. And you notice, unlike the Foresters, and she has less people there, she doesn't eat anything to make sure that she has enough food on the table for them. So that's how tight it is at the Baxters. And you'll notice in this chapter, Buck and Millwell kind of can tell how tight it is, especially Buck, who stays. Jody doesn't get it yet. Okay. So they finish their breakfast, and then Jody goes and he talks to his father about the fawn, and he wants to keep it. And Penny has the love of nature that Jody has. So when he says, "We taken its mammy, and it wasn't no ways to blame," and of course at this point, he has his father hooked. Pa tells Ma he's going to go get the fawn and bring it back, and so he rides with Millwell out there because Millwell's going to go home to check on everything and check on following. He's going to ride with Millwell, and Millwell will drop him off. And the doc, they're like, "I don't know how we're going to pay you." And he's like, "I didn't do anything." But Jody gives him that, if you remember that albino raccoon they made that sack out of, he gives it to the doc. So the doc leaves, and you have Jody ride with Millwell. So you have a little bit of a conversation there, and it talks about the fight. And Millwell asks, kind of, why were you fighting for Oliver? And really, Jody just says, because it was an unfair fight. And Millwell says, "You're right. It was Lem's gal and Oliver's gal. They should have fought." He says, "Fit." But they should have fought it out themselves. We shouldn't have stepped in, and they know it. So here's where you see a separation between the Foresters. We know Fodderwing is good, and you see here Millwell, like, they're going to fight with their brother, but they'll admit it, that we shouldn't have stepped in. Like, it should have been a fair fight. We didn't have any reason to be fighting. And then it talks about the hogs, like, why were y'all out? And Millwell's wondering, and it says, "Pa got snake bit when we were hunting our hogs." And then he goes, "Oh, your hogs. I'm sure they'll be home soon." So it kind of hints that Millwell's going to make sure that the hogs are released, because he says, "I had no idea you all was running so tight." Again, Buck and Millwell and them, they haven't been there at the Baxters very long, but they can tell, as far as food and things like that, it's a tight ship for their family. So he can tell that quickly, and then the response by Jody is, "We ain't running tight. We're all right." Again, he doesn't understand that part yet, but the Foresters, those boys in 2 seconds can tell. So he asks Millwell about Fodderwing, and he says he's just sick. He's ailing, and they're not sure what's wrong with him. And of course, Jody's like, "I just want to see him." And he says, "You will eventually. When he gets better, you can see him." "Not yet. Lem's still a little angry, but eventually you can." So he drops him off, and he finds the dead doe. And of course, nearby, he finds the fawn, and he carries it for part of the way. And then the fawn just kind of follows him home. And so here we have Jody with something of his own, something to call his own that he loves. And he's so excited about it. And of course, Ma's not happy about it because they're tight with food as it is. And basically, Penny says, "I don't want to hear any more about it. He's keeping the creature. I took its mother. This is what's going to happen." So we have the milk that was Jody's ration is going to be given to the fawn. And he keeps it out in the barn where the cow is. And as far as the next day, keeping the fawn in there, it's pretty simple. And as far as talking about Fodderwing, it kind of brings up again and again that he's ailing, he's not feeling well, but eventually once Lim cools down, he can go over and see him. Jody's kind of excited about that. So in here in the evening, remember that we still have Bucks at the house, and it says, with only Penny to do, we ain't got the rations plentiful like you folks, but we do eat clean and decent. And you have Buck promise that they'll go hunting and get some meat and things like that. And that Buck will take Jody hunting and all that type of thing. And basically, Buck's stepping in and doing everything he can to help them out. Because again, just like Millwell, he can tell how tight it is for them. And with the fawn, you'll notice Jody can't figure out a name. So Buck says, don't you worry about it. Fodderwing will help you name that creature. I mean, look, think about all the creatures Fodderwing has. He'll come up with a name. So, chapter 16, last one. You still have the fawn. Jody's spending a ton of time with it, which you can imagine. And Buck has been literally working over the top for them, clearing extra fields, hunting, etc. And she just can't believe how much work that one man has done. And of course, it talks about in there when Jody gets bigger to help Penny, they'll do better because they can plant more crops, more land, etc., etc. But the amount of work that Buck has done, I mean, Ma Baxter has got, Ma is just totally taken aback and can't believe how much he's done and cleared extra land that they can actually plant cotton on, which means that they could actually sell it and make a little money, which the Baxters never have been able to do. And Penny eventually is getting a little stronger. It says he still gets really dizzy. He's still pretty weak. But Buck has done so much that they haven't necessarily missed Penny's work or ability to work because Buck has been there for them. So it says that they wake up the morning of the 8th day that Buck has been there. And it says some of their corn has been stripped, which is a big deal for them. Think about how many things you make out of corn, and it's also big for their animals. So it says foxes have been out there, and eventually they're going to go hunting for them. So while they're waiting, they decide to go to a bee tree and get a bunch of honey. And it as they're going to the bee tree, you find out that Buck is going to go home soon. It says he has just a feeling about Fodderwing, and he's been so sick. He hasn't been away that long ever, so he wants to check on him. He's worried about him. So you have the scene where they get they put the rags in there, light it on fire, and they get all the honey and all of that, and it's a huge amount. And as far as the honey, Buck says, of course he wants some because there's so much, and of course they're going to give him some. But Buck at this point is anxious, and he wants to get home to Fodderwing. So before he goes, you have Buck talk about the trade of the dog with Lim. And of course, Buck can laugh about it, but Lim doesn't think it's funny because, of course, he found out the dog, just like Penny said, was absolutely awful hunting dog. And that Lim has already shot the dog and buried it. He was so awful. But Lim doesn't think it's funny. He's actually quite angry about it. So that night, before Buck leaves, they're going to hunt foxes. And they do. They kill a couple out there so it doesn't get in their corn. And while they're hunting foxes and killing it, all of a sudden there's a huge commotion at the house, and Ma and Penny are screaming. And so they get back, and here's a bear, a 2-year-old male, a young male bear. And of course, there are 2 new things that bear smelled on Baxter's Island that drew him in: the amount of honey that they have, and then, of course, the fawn. So now they have some extra meat. They've got hide. They've got bear fat, and it says Ma gives some fat to Buck and the liver, which has a lot of iron and all that kind of stuff in it, to give to Fodderwing to help him out. And so you have Penny and Buck, of course, telling stories, and you have Jody kind of fall asleep, and he creeps and lets the fawn come inside and sleep with him. And that's how chapter 16 ends.